October 12, 1917, 4:40 a.m. Passchendaele Ridge, Belgium. The rain has not stopped for days. Mud swallows boots whole, rifles jam. The sky is a low ceiling of smoke and artillery flash. Somewhere in the dark, a flare lifts briefly, casting a silver glare over the broken skeletons of trees, and the trench walls collapse again under the weight of another shell. Captain Charles Hazlitt Upham of the New Zealand Expeditionary Force stands waist-deep in that mud. He is 30 years old, former schoolteacher, commissioned officer. In his hands, a short magazine Lee Enfield rifle slick with rain and soil. Over his shoulder, a bandolier of ammunition already running low. The bombardment does not pause. German artillery crashes into the forward line with mechanical precision. Each impact lifts the earth like a fist striking upward from below. Men shout. Someone screams for a stretcher bearer. Someone else doesn't scream at all. Upham does not shout. He moves. Not fast, not dramatically. He steps through the mud as if the ground were solid. A shell detonates close enough to knock two soldiers flat. One lies twisted against the duckboards, thigh torn open by shrapnel. The other blinks up at the sky, stunned, unable to move. Upham kneels. No speech, no command. He pulls the wounded man toward the partial cover of a sandbagged traverse. He presses a field dressing against the wound, ties it tight, too tight maybe. There is no time to measure comfort. Another shell closer. Dirt rains down. The trench wall caves inward, burying a private up to his chest. Upham moves again. There is something unsettling about the way he moves, not fearless, not reckless. The men around him will later struggle to describe it. It was as if he had already accepted something the rest of them were still arguing with. Death, perhaps. Or something quieter. You can almost feel it that moment when the body trembles but the face does not, when fear exists but it has been placed somewhere else, contained, negotiated. From a Jungian perspective, this is not denial. It is contact. Jungian psychology suggests that in moments of extremity the personality can fracture or it can consolidate. The shadow, that buried reservoir of instinct and terror, rises to meet the ego, and sometimes instead of fighting it, a person makes an agreement. Not today. Upham shoulders his rifle and climbs partially out of the trench to get a clearer line of sight. Bullets snap overhead. Machine gun fire from the German pillboxes rakes the ridge. He fires deliberately, one shot at a time, adjusting for distance, breath steady. The men near him notice something. His voice, when he does speak, is low, almost conversational. Shift left. Stay down. Wait for the flare. No theatrics, no speeches. Around him, panic pulses like electricity. Young soldiers barely out of adolescence clutch rifles with shaking hands. One private vomits between volleys. Upham's composure becomes a structure the others lean against. But here is the strange part. He is not immune to fear. His letters from the front will later reveal exhaustion, doubt, an acute awareness of mortality. He knows the statistics of Passchendaele, thousands already lost to mud, artillery, and miscalculation. Yet in this moment, something inside him has gone silent. Not numb. Silent. There is a difference. Silence here is not emptiness, it is compression, an inward turning of energy, a refusal to broadcast the storm within. How many times have you done the same? Not in a trench, not under artillery fire, but in a room where everyone was waiting for you to react. A confrontation, a betrayal, a moment when you could have defended yourself, explained your motives, justified your exhaustion, announced your pain. And instead you said nothing. Not because you had no feelings. Because something older stepped forward. Back on the ridge, Upham sees movement near a shattered wire entanglement 50 yards ahead. A wounded soldier lies exposed in the open ground between trenches, no man's land, now a swamp of cratered water and floating debris. To go out there is madness. The machine guns have the angle. He does not consult anyone. He slides over the parapet and drops into the mud. The sound changes immediately. Out in the open, the artillery feels closer, more intimate. Bullets crack past his ears, the mud sucks at his legs, threatening to pull him down. He reaches the wounded man, a corporal from another company, face pale, breathing shallow. Easy, Upham says. No promise of safety, just presence. He hoists the corporal over his shoulder and begins the slow return. Each step is an act of defiance against gravity and probability. A shell detonates behind him, spraying fragments. One piece tears through his coat, grazing his side. He does not stop. From a Jungian perspective, this is the moment of initiation. Not public, not ceremonial. Private. Jungian psychology suggests that initiation is often misunderstood. It is not about heroism, it is about integration, the moment when vulnerability and duty cease to compete and instead align. Upham is afraid. But fear is no longer arguing with him. By the time he reaches the trench again, he is bleeding slightly from the graze. A medic reaches for him. I'm fine, he says. And moves on. Fine. The most understated word in warfare. The bombardment continues for hours, men fall, orders shift, the advance stalls in the mud, but throughout it Captain Upham remains composed, impossibly composed, according to those who survive the day. They will later recommend him for the Victoria Cross. But medals are not the point. The point is the silence. What happened inside him that morning? What decision was made not in words but in alignment that allowed him to walk through chaos without broadcasting his terror? Because something did happen. And if you look carefully at your own life, you may find a similar morning. A moment when the earth gave way. And instead of collapsing with it, a quieter version of you stood up. But where did that version come from? And what did it cost? The rain thickens by midday. Passchendaele is no longer a battlefield in the traditional sense. It is a drowning ground. Trenches have dissolved into canals of brown water. Duckboards float like broken ribs. The air smells of cordite, wet wool, and something metallic beneath it all. Captain Charles Upham has already been hit once. A fragment of shrapnel sliced through his shoulder hours ago. The field dressing is tight beneath his tunic, darkening steadily. He refused evacuation. There is no time for that. The New Zealanders are pinned by interlocking machine gun fire from concrete pillboxes embedded along the ridge. German MG-08 crews sweep the open ground with ruthless discipline. Every attempt to advance is punished instantly. Upham studies the pattern. Not frantically, not angrily. Carefully. He signals to a small group, a lance corporal, two privates, one of them barely 19. Their faces are drained of color, the kind of faces that haven't yet learned how to hide fear. We'll flank left, he says quietly. No speech about glory, no insistence on bravery. Just direction. You can almost see the invisible shift happening inside him. Pain, fatigue, uncertainty, they are present, but they are no longer at the center. Something else has taken command, something steadier. From a Jungian perspective, this is where the negotiation deepens. Jungian psychology suggests that when a person encounters overwhelming chaos, the psyche has two options: fragment or integrate. The shadow, fear, rage, helplessness rises with enormous force. If denied, it consumes. If dramatized, it destabilizes. But if acknowledged, it becomes fuel. Upham does not appear fearless because he lacks fear. He appears composed because fear has been given its place, not at the helm but not exiled either. They move through a communication trench half collapsed by shellfire. At one junction they pause, machine gun bursts stitch across the mud ahead, the lance corporal hesitates. For a fraction of a second, everything hangs. This is the moment most men speak too loudly, overcompensate, assert dominance over their own dread. Upham does not. He simply meets the corporal's eyes. And nods. It is a small gesture, almost invisible. But it says, I know, and we move anyway. They break from cover in staggered bursts, slipping through shell craters toward a low rise that partially conceals the German position. Upham fires controlled shots, drawing attention to himself deliberately. A bullet grazes his helmet rim, he barely reacts. There is something unsettling about this kind of restraint. Because it forces a question. What part of a man becomes this still? Later, survivors will recall that Upham seemed as if he had already made peace with the cost. That phrase lingers. Made peace. Not with death exactly, but with the possibility of it, with the loss of reputation, with the end of explanations. How many of us resist that peace? In everyday life, we argue with outcomes endlessly. We rehearse defenses in the shower, we replay conversations, we craft explanations that may never be spoken. But there are moments, rare, irreversible, when something inside us stops arguing. Not out of defeat, out of clarity. Upham reaches the flank of the pillbox. The concrete structure looms ahead, low and brutal, muzzle flashes erupting from narrow slits. One of the privates is hit in the leg and falls hard, crying out. Upham crawls to him under active fire. The mud is cold now, it seeps through wool and into bone. He drags the private behind the partial cover of a crater, applies a dressing with one hand while firing his rifle with the other. There is no theatrical anger, no shouted defiance. Just work. From a Jungian perspective, this is individuation under fire. Not the romanticized version, but the real one. Jungian psychology suggests that individuation is the process of becoming whole, and wholeness is not softness, it is not constant self-expression, it is the ability to hold contradiction without collapse. Upham is holding contradiction. He is compassionate and lethal, afraid and decisive, bleeding and composed. The pillbox must be silenced. He signals again, coordinates a small maneuver. Grenades arc through the rain-heavy air, one detonates at the firing slit. The machine gun stutters, then stops. Silence brief, stunned. They advance. Inside the shattered emplacement, German soldiers lie wounded or dazed. Upham does not gloat. He does not rage. He ensures the threat is neutralized, then immediately turns back toward his own line. Always back toward the wounded. Always back toward the quiet work. The 19-year-old private stares at him differently now, not with awe, with something closer to reliance. Composure is contagious. But here is the deeper layer. When a man like Upham chooses silence in chaos, he is not merely stabilizing others. He is stabilizing himself. Because if he were to narrate his fear aloud, if he were to dramatize the horror, it would fracture the fragile agreement inside him. And that agreement is everything. You may recognize this in your own life. The moment you stopped explaining your boundaries, stopped defending your exhaustion, stopped announcing your disappointment. Not because it didn't matter. Because you understood that speaking it into the wrong space would weaken you. Silence in that moment was not repression. It was containment. By late afternoon, the ridge is barely gained, casualties are severe, the ground has cost more than it has yielded. Upham is now wounded again, this time more seriously, a bullet passing through his hip. Medics insist he withdraw. He refuses. There is still work to do. Still men to retrieve. Still decisions to carry quietly. The rain does not let up. And neither does he. But every negotiation has a limit. Every silent agreement extracts something in return. As dusk begins to swallow the ridge, the question is no longer whether Captain Upham can endure. It is how much of himself he is leaving behind in the mud. Dusk settles without ceremony. October 12, 1917, 6:17 p.m. The ridge is barely visible now, a torn silhouette against a sky the color of wet ash. The firing has thinned but not stopped. Occasional rifle cracks echo across the mud-choked expanse. The wounded still call out in low, fatting voices. Stretcher bearers move carefully, stepping where others have already stepped because the ground itself cannot be trusted. Captain Charles Upham is no longer standing. He is propped against the inner wall of a collapsed trench, breath shallow, uniform stiff with drying blood. The bullet through his hip has made walking nearly impossible. The earlier shrapnel wound burns beneath soaked fabric. A medic kneels beside him. "Sir, you're done." Upham's eyes scan the ridge instead of answering. There are still men unaccounted for. Still shapes in the mud that might move if someone reaches them in time. He tries to rise and fails. For the first time that day, something breaks through the surface, not panic, not fear. Frustration. Not at the enemy. At his own body. This is the part history rarely lingers on, the slowing, the point where willpower collides with flesh and loses. From a Jungian perspective, this is where the shadow returns with interest. All day, Upham has negotiated with it. He has allowed fear to exist without governing him. He has held vulnerability and duty in the same frame. But now, stripped of movement, stripped of function, he is left with himself. No action to hide inside. No wounded man to carry. Just pain in the quiet aftermath. Jungian psychology suggests that true integration is tested not in movement but in stillness, when the role falls away, when the identity of the composed one can no longer be performed. What remains? Around him, soldiers move with cautious reverence. Word has spread through the line, the captain who walked through machine gun fire, who crossed no man's land more than once, who refused evacuation until his body forced the decision. They look at him differently now. But he does not look back with pride. There is no visible triumph in his expression, no dramatic reckoning. Only exhaustion. You can almost feel the interior shift happening, the moment when adrenaline drains and the full weight of experience settles into the nervous system. This is often where the real cost begins. Not during the crisis. After. The stretcher bearers lift him carefully, the motion sends a shock through his hip. He grips the edge of the canvas but makes no sound. Silence again. Not because he feels nothing. Because the agreement still holds. But something inside him has changed. Earlier that morning, silence was a tool, a stabilizer, a container for fear. Now it becomes something heavier, something closer to isolation. When you are the composed one who carries you. When you are the one who doesn't react, who absorbs tension instead of dispersing it, where does that absorbed tension go? Upham is carried down the slope as night swallows the ridge. Flares arc occasionally overhead, briefly illuminating the churned landscape, bodies, broken equipment, abandoned packs half submerged in water. The stretcher tilts, he stares up at the sky. Rain hits his face. In that quiet transit away from the front line, there is no cheering, no ceremony, just the steady rhythm of boots in mud. From a Jungian perspective, this is the second initiation. The first was action. The second is reckoning. Jungian psychology suggests that when a person makes peace with the cost of action, the psyche reorganizes around that acceptance. But acceptance does not erase consequence, it reshapes identity. Something older did take over in him that day. But it did not come for free. Because when you consistently choose silence under pressure, when you refuse to dramatize your fear, your hurt, your confusion, you become strong. Yes. But you also become separate. Others see your steadiness. They do not see the negotiation. They do not see the part of you that trembled and was told, gently but firmly, to step aside. Upham would later receive the Victoria Cross for his actions during the war, one of the highest military decorations in the British Empire. He would go on to serve again in the Second World War, earning a second Victoria Cross, a rarity almost unheard of. History will remember the medals. But history cannot measure the interior cost of becoming impossibly composed. That cost is private. And perhaps you know something about it. Not from artillery fire, but from quieter battlefields. The day you realized explaining yourself was useless. The moment you saw that reacting emotionally would only destabilize the room. The season of your life when you absorbed disappointment without broadcasting it. You may not have received a medal. But something inside you hardened. Not into bitterness. Into structure. And yet, there is always a question that lingers beneath that structure. If the composed self took over, where did the softer self go? Is it integrated? Or buried? As the stretcher disappears into the darkness beyond the ridge, the rain continues to fall over Passchendaele, indifferent, steady, erasing footprints almost as soon as they are made. Captain Charles Upham survives that day. But survival is not the end of the story. Because the part of you that chooses silence, the part that makes peace with the cost, does not simply disappear when the crisis ends. It stays. The real question is, did it protect you? Or did it replace you?